So welcome everyone to the U.S. Human Proteome Organization, U.S. HUPO's Early Career Researcher. These career panels have been very popular with both trainees, early career researchers, and maybe even senior career researchers have also found them to be pretty informative. In these series, we try to highlight careers that maybe you won't hear about in your training programs. So kind of steering away from the typical academic track and industry track to explore some of the options that maybe you've never heard of and didn't even know were available to you. Today, we have four excellent panelists that I'm going to let introduce themselves. Let's kick it off with Susan Marcus. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the invite, Lindsay and Alex, setting this up. I'm delighted to be here to share my experiences. So my background is a PhD from Wake Forest, an MBA from Yale University. So really combining the technical side with the business side. My current position is the Executive Director of Precision Biomarker Laboratories at Cedars-Sinai. And previous to that, I was at the Jackson Laboratory for Genomic Medicine. In both cases, I've been launching new business units, for-profit business units within the context of larger nonprofit organizations with heavy research and academia-like feel. So I'll be excited to comment more on depth in that in a little bit later.
Great, thanks, Susan. Let's kick it over to Steve now.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Thanks, Lindsay, for inviting me to the panel here. I'm excited to be here and kind of give back on, what some options are pursuing a career after a PhD, because that's not really baked into the curriculum usually. Right now, I'm a patent agent at Cooley LLP. I work with biotechnology companies, helping them to protect their target products and figure out, what are the patent strategies we use to get there. But I took kind of a long, windy path to get to this role. I have a kind of a history in startups. After undergrad, I worked at a startup for a little while in Kalamazoo, Michigan called CTOX. I was one of 4 people in the lab. And that kind of sparked my love for startups because I got to work with the founders, the CSO, the COO, and they all had PhDs. And I was like, that's what I want to do. So I decided to go back to grad school, and I got a PhD in molecular pharmacology from Purdue. I worked with Lori Parker, and in that lab, we were developing cell-based kinase assays, and we were actually developing an IP portfolio around them. So Lori, recognizing that I wasn't totally interested in the academic career, allowed me to be sort of the IP liaison for the lab. And I worked with the tech transfer office at Purdue to help write disclosures for the lab. And from that came as an opportunity for to pursue, a company. I wrote a business plan. And then once I graduated, we were able to in-license that IP portfolio. And then I worked as the chief technology there for about 5 years, did everything a founder does from, raising funding all the way through managing the IP portfolio, doing the business development aspects, doing partnerships, all this sort of thing. And so when, unfortunately, that didn't work out, I moved into IP because I had extensive experience there, and it allowed me to sort of keep an eye on what was trending in the biotechnology ecosystem at large. And so that's kind of where I'm at now.
Yeah, awesome. I love highlighting the winding path. I think it's fantastic. Let's go to Emily next.
Hi, really excited to be here today, Lindsay. Thanks so much for the introduction. My name's Emily. One of the reasons I'm really excited to be here is because I am currently in a job that I did not know existed about 5 years ago when I was in my PhD. So happy to chat about that. It's been a while since I've had a proteomics experience. I worked with Lindsay actually about 10 years ago at the Broad Institute in the proteomics platform. But after that, got my PhD in chemistry, focusing on synthetic biology from UC Berkeley. My winding path went through consulting actually for about a year and a half, where I did both private equity diligence work and healthcare strategy. And I currently am working as a senior research associate at a healthcare-focused private equity company doing both technical and market diligence work.
I love it. And last but very much not least, Marco.
Thanks, Lindsay. I had a similar path to both Stephen and Emily. I worked at a small company after my undergrad and realized that, man, the things that I want to do really require a PhD, so I should probably go get one of those things. And you'll have to excuse my mask. I'm actually now in the offices of the company that I started out of my PhD lab, which happens to be the same one that Emily was in. So we had a lovely time working together during our PhD. I was also joint with the Jennifer Doudna lab, which puts me in a pretty odd space in the protein genomics intersection there. And coming out of my PhD, we happened across some really cool technology that we developed, and we are doing the path that Stephen did earlier in his career, which is licensing it out and starting a company and trying to see if we can make that work. And it's a pretty exciting process.
Yeah, so as everyone can clearly tell now, we've assembled an extremely diverse and unique set of experiences here, both in current career path, in maybe at first planned career path, and how that's kind of evolved over time. So anybody is welcome to ask questions in the chat, but I'm going to kick it off with the question, what does a day in your job look like? So we'll go backwards this time. Marco, what does like a day in a startup founder's job look like?
Yeah, the fun thing about it is it's even more varied than a day in a PhD life. You kind of, I hop between having days completely full of back-to-back meetings, trying to get investors or collaborators or partners on board. And then in the afternoons or even full days, I'll spend just trying to develop the technology in the lab. And so I'm currently splitting my time pretty evenly between the two pursuits. I can see on the horizon that I will have my lab time will be diminishing rapidly as I get more and more caught up with the meetings and hiring. But that's about an average day for me.
Awesome. So let's kick it over to Emily now, going backwards.
Yeah, so for me, my day is also split between a couple of buckets, but lab work is not one of them. And so when we talk about like, you know, how I ended up in this job, like one of the things for me was realizing late in my PhD that like I love a lot about science, but I don't, like lab work is not one of the things that I love. So when I split my sort of time between buckets, one of them is like the private equity version of lab work, which is like doing data analysis, like doing actual getting in the weeds and doing analytics work. I read papers. Like basically I'm trying to do the things that help us make a solid decision on an investment. So that's sort of like one bucket of like what I actively do. And that can look different things, you know, in different ways for different types of companies. And then, you know, other things are like various levels of like meetings and process and strategy and management, which probably looks kind of similar to how Marco described the second bucket. And those are probably the two major pieces that I do. And like both of those are build towards these moments where we are making like basically go, no go decisions on company investments. Those are more rare, but it's sort of like that's sort of what the goal is.
Yeah, and Stephen, day in your current job, what does that?
Oh man, it depends on which day it is. But so I work with a lot of different clients, right? I work with companies in all phases of sort of the business life cycle, from founders who haven't even incorporated yet to, you know, 5-person teams in an established company with maybe a seed round, to all the way through companies that are public. So I see a lot of different aspects of what the founders, the you know, lead science minds in the company are thinking about. And so I work with them on whatever it is they sort of need from us at the time. So a lot of my work is taking data dumps from research groups at these companies and figuring out what kind of patents can we actually pursue, and what type of products are you trying to develop, and working with them in that capacity and figuring out like what are the claim sets you want. So it's a lot of patent writing, a lot of patent prosecution, which is where you're arguing with the USPTO over whether or not a claim is legit or not. And then working with the, well, I say working, but it's actually like this sort of nice argument with the USPTO, and trying to figure out, you know, how do we get this patent granted? So that's kind of one bucket, is the patent drafting and prosecution part. Another part is the consulting part, where we're working with companies on things like licenses. So we'll review the terms in a license for, these are usually related to newer companies, or we'll work with maybe a more established company that's working with an even bigger fish, where they have a partnership, and it's leading to whether or not the bigger fish is gonna, you know, exercise an option. So in that case, we might be basically straightening out their IP portfolio, making sure that all of the chains of title are correct, and you know, the IP is strong. And then another bucket we do is what we call diligence projects. And so this can be anytime there's a deal between, say, a VC making an investment in a company, or it can be an underwriting investment bank in a company that's going IPO. What we'll do is we'll work, depending on who the client is, to make sure that, you know, the company's IP actually covers its target product, and ensure that process. In the case of an IPO, we'll work on editing, say, an S1 SEC document to make sure that everything is accurate, because that's essentially an investor document, right? That's what is presented to the public, and that's what they use to decide whether or not to invest. So we have to make sure that everything in that document is accurate. And so that's part of the diligence projects. There's other random things that are pretty interesting. For example, you know, I had a client recently do a $500 million deal with a big pharma company. And so that's, you know, that's like milestone driven. They're working towards a therapeutic product. And so one of my jobs was to look through that 3-year research R&D plan towards the target product, and then say, where in this plan can we pull out new patents, new IP? And then, you know, we have to read the agreement with that larger company and make sure that our client is complying with everything that they have to do as part of that agreement in terms of IP. So it's all over the place. IP can cover a lot of different aspects.
Yeah, awesome. I think a lot of people just think, oh, it's writing patents. It's like, nope,
Yeah.
there's a lot of other stuff going on there. And Susan, what does a day in your job look like?
Never goes as planned. So it's really being the ability to pivot quickly, right? So I would say it's a 3-pronged cycle every day that I go through. Leadership first, strategy second, execution third, and different components of a day will go through that iterative cycle, but it all revolves around leadership and team first. So a typical day would be checking in with team. What do folks need? Making sure projects are moving. You know, sometimes, you know, even though we're in the context of Cedars-Sinai, it operates very much like a startup. So all the functionalities required. The only difference is we don't actually have to go outside to raise capital, but we do have to justify, you know, getting CapEx budgets and everything else from, you know, executive VPs at the higher level of the organization. So one day, you know, I might go in, meet with one-on-ones with teams, make sure projects are moving. I may have to dip in and understand a lot. I've learned a lot. I come from a genomics background, so I'm learning a lot about mass spec and proteomics, understanding instrumentation. So I love that part of the utilizing my technical background to help make decisions. So that's one big component. You know, another day it might be, you know, an air conditioning unit is leaking on $1 million mass spec machine, right? Like, or another day I might be, you know, marketing, you know, I got to make photocopies for collateral. So it runs very much like a startup where any given day, you always are trying to get to your job, which is for me is really developing the business development statements of work for clients, scoping out budgeting projects, and planning. But again, it really, if for me, I saw the question in the chat about how do you develop your non-laboratory based skills. And that's something coming out of my PhD program that I didn't have, and I didn't know what I was missing until I got into the space and started making mistakes. And, why isn't this team running? Why can't people read my mind? I don't understand. And really learning how to articulate, engage people, and also adjusting management styles for different people. The same style is not going to work for everybody. And the most important thing is to be reflective. If you've had a bad day or like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, go in and correct it, right? I read a lot of leadership books. I got going back to me for an MBA was really critical because that's where I really saw skills that I needed to acquire and things that I used to be like, oh, leadership, I don't need that psychobabble stuff. It was like, oh, I actually do. And when I pay attention and continually work on it for myself and my team, doing peer-to-peer mentoring, finding other mentors, and really allowing myself to make mistakes, knowing that I'm not perfect either, and being reflective is really how I've started to, focus on that leadership component.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and you kind of got it. I think a question that not even is specific to just spin outs and startups, but how do you build these skills when your PhD basically just focuses on how to sit at the bench or at the computer if you're computational and then spit papers out? Like, if that's kind of the cycle that you're trained as a PhD, how do you get these skills? Are there internship opportunities or programs that are available for trainees to gain leadership or strategy? I know, Marco, you did a program where you met your co-founder. Maybe you can speak a little about some of those opportunities.
Yeah, I started off just becoming interested in startups, and that was, as Susan said, there's a lot of really good books on leadership, and just diving into just we're really good as scientists at going to the primary source material and reading up on things, and so that's a great place to start. I then benefited from being physically located right next door to the MBA program at Berkeley's campus, and so I then took classes over there. Most universities have tried to foster an innovative ecosystem as much as they can. There's a strong benefit for them and in financial upsides in the long term in most cases. And so most universities have ecosystems around it. So for Berkeley, it's the Citrus Foundry. There are free resources where you can learn how to make a startup happen. The iCourse program is a more national type of a program where that's actually leads well into the small business grant system for the NSF and the NIH. But there are many different programs you can take advantage of. The other area, and for me, that MBA program, as Lindsay alluded to, is where I met my co-founder. I knew that as a scientist, I was severely lacking in a lot of the skills that Susan then went back for her MBA for. I knew that I didn't have the time to acquire them in the time frame that I wanted to start the company. And so bringing on someone who had those skills and had specifically done his MBA to develop those skills was really helpful in just setting up our company for success. And I think that for many people, if they don't have a specific idea they want to start on, there are a lot of early stage VCs that do offer internships where you can get some exposure to startups and startup investing. And I would recommend those as a good kind of early introduction. They're always looking for fresh PhDs who are kind of keyed into the pipeline of what's coming out and what's new. And so I think it's a really good opportunity for many people.
I think maybe the thing I would add to that Marco, I agree with everything you just said. I think the other piece, and Lindsay, you kind of alluded to this even in your question, is you basically have to look for it. Like it's not gonna fall into your lap in your PhD. It's not something that we're intentionally or specifically trained on. Like when I interviewed for consulting jobs, I talked about 2 extracurriculars in managing undergrad. Like they didn't even talk about my research like at all. So like and so it's like, do you have an extracurricular you can get involved in? Is there a startup you can just meet with once a week and consult for? Like, is there a class you can take? Is there a free online class you can take if your university doesn't have it? Like, it's a little bit of like trying stuff, figuring out what is available to you in your particular situation and program, and then going after it.
Yeah, I would also add to that a lot of the aligning yourself with a business school. So a lot of business schools also have case competitions and they're looking for interdisciplinary folks to join. And so I used to help judge at the Yale healthcare case competition every year. And it was great because they pull people in from the public health school, from the MD programs, and they wanted groups of 5 that had really diverse backgrounds. And it's a great way to get in there, with everybody bringing their areas of expertise, developing a business plan, presenting it, and people are always welcoming the different backgrounds. So it's a definite research, and there's lots of those competitions around the different areas, and it's a nice way to get a taste for what it's like. If you were going to go out, do a startup and start doing pitches and things like this, it's a great way to get good experience in that area and writing business plans and presenting them.
I'll just second everything everyone just said. I don't have much to add other than the idea of actively performing informational interviews. Find the people that are doing the things that you're interested in doing or things that you don't know about. Make a set of assumptions and go talk to them. Figure out, like, am I right about how this works? Am I not right? Like, how can they teach me? And that's what the iCore program that Marco mentioned is all about. So I went through this with my startup. We had gotten a couple of SBIRs, and as part of that, we did the iCore program. And the whole premise of that is performing at least 100 informational interviews over the course of 2 months. So that requires you to take a look at the technology you're working with, your target product, figuring out everyone in between that's required to go from idea to marketed product, and identify those people and then ask them, how does this work? This is how I think it works, and I might be entirely wrong, but just go talk to somebody who knows. And then you can start filling in those gaps. And I would say that doing the 100+ informational interviews over those 2 months was the most intense learning experience of my life.
Yeah, this iCore program that Marco and Stephen have mentioned, a bunch of different universities have this NSF program, and it's really, I think, gets at Alexandra's question, which is, how do you even start looking for information about how to launch a spin-off for your biotech product? How do you get that started? What are the first steps? What do you even do for that? So maybe this is, I don't know, who do you think wants to go first to answer this one? How do you get started with spinning out a company? Say you're at a university, you're doing your PhD, you think something might be a cool company idea, you're not going to take that idea into an academic lab as a tenure track professor. What's the first step? Is the first step go ask for funding from people like Emily? Do you file a patent like with Stephen? Do you go to the university and talk to someone like Susan? Do you go like Marco and start taking business classes? What is, I guess, everybody might have a different opinion. What's kind of the first things that you do?
Okay. My opinion on this has evolved over time. So when I started Kind of Sense, I thought I knew exactly what the technology was going to be as a product. I thought, we were going to develop this brilliant diagnostic tool out of it. And then I started talking to people about that concept, and they said, no, back up. Like, here's where it can actually be purposed and turned into a product. So I think you can have the idea, right? That's your starting point, but also be humble about, you might be wrong, and start thinking about what we call product market fit. So I see Marco and Lindsay like shaking their head. This is a huge thing that we don't think about as scientists, is that, what does the market actually need? So one part of that is maybe discovering all of the adjacent products or technologies around what you want to commercialize and develop. So I would say, for one, get your idea written down, and then start doing this exploration around the idea, which is not only seeing what's already out there, but also talking to the people who have done similar things.
Yeah, I strongly support it. I would try and insert one thing above, and I'm actually surprised you didn't go with this one, Stephen, which is you should almost certainly, if you think you have something cool that you found in lab, you should almost certainly report it to your university, because A, it's your obligation. B, if you publish anything or even give a poster presentation on that material in a public setting, which is a conference, unless it's like a university internal conference, you can no longer patent that, which means you can no longer protect it, which means in most cases, you will not be able to find anyone to give you money to form a company around it. And so I would start immediately by making sure that you have IP protection for it. Unless you've come up with this idea completely separate from your lab and your lab resources, the university already owns that IP. They just don't know about it yet. And so it is your job to report it to them. And that's actually good for you, because then you don't have to worry about the headaches of, filing patents, because the university will often handle most of that for you. You kind of just get to do the data dump, and then people like Stephen get to do the actual patent creation for you. You don't, as a grad student, you don't have to magically understand how to write a patent. That's not going to be your job. And that was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. Because I thought when we were starting to like, oh, we might have something cool here in lab, I didn't realize how easy it was going to be to file that IP, because there are people like Stephen that can turn my messy data dump and like rough draft of a paper that I sent over into this beautiful 100-page patent document. That was a much easier process than I had anticipated.
So also going along with that, so in my previous job, when I left at Jax, I was the director of commercialization. So actually going with PIs, looking for potential things that they had to commercialize. And the two pitfalls that I identified, one is, yes, it could be really cool science. I know you're super, super excited, but there's two issues. What is the unmet need, right? Kind of going, what is the product fit? You got to find what is the unmet need. You could have the coolest science or the coolest gadget, but if nobody's going to use it, it doesn't fit a need that's in the marketplace, it's not going to go anywhere. The second issue that I find is articulating your idea and turning your pitch as you're talking about your idea to address your audience. So sometimes, rambling on in granular details, and I'd be like, it sounds really cool, but I really don't know what you're talking about. And I feel, you've got to be able to adjust it, and saying the same thing in a complicated way doesn't sell your idea. So really pitching to multiple different people, friends and family outside of the industry to get feedback. Can I communicate my idea at a very high level, why this is important for humans, for in disease, or for the veterinary, whatever, right? Can I communicate that to a lay audience? And really working on that pitch, does it have an unmet need? And I think those are really two important places to start.
I guess. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Marco.
The one thing that I think that we haven't touched on here is somewhere kind of in between these two things, which is the communication is the vital step, and finding product market fit is very important. The last part that has been the hardest for me as a scientist is, how do I make that make money? Because that thing is what we call the business plan. And so how you actually turn this fundamental science into something that someone will pay for is a very interesting thing, because you can either license off the ability to do this thing to people, and that's one way of making money off it. You can make it into a product that you're selling. All of these different things are valid approaches, but that's a thing that as a scientist was anathema to what I had been trained to do. And so that was a very big mindset shift for me.
This is a big topic that Marco just touched on, with the whole idea of how do you build a business model. And as baked into the iCore curriculum is the business model canvas. So just if you're more interested in thinking about how do I build a business model, just Google that, and you'll see how it segments the entire business model into very specific areas, right? And the whole idea is that you go through and make assumptions about each section in the business model, and then perform informational interviews to determine whether or not you're right.
Yeah, and as we're talking about things like business models and patenting and finding product market fit, I guess kind of a question for Emily: how does all of this weigh in when you go to ask for fundraising? Like at your job, like are some of these more important than others? Kind of as scientists, we just think like, oh, I'm doing a cool science thing. Everybody will obviously appreciate it just inherently because it's academically cool.
Yeah, it's a good question. So from where I'm sitting, we basically look for companies that have both. Like you need to have great technology that is solving an unmet need, but you also need to have thought through your business plan and specifically who your target market is, and how that is going to translate into something that can make money. So to me, like both of those pieces are incredibly important, and we look for companies that have thought through both of them. You can see both sometimes. You'll see companies that have one but not the other, either like very strong on the technology but don't have like a great sense of like who the target customer is, for example, or you'll have companies who actually have like a pretty great business plan, but when you dig into the technology, it's not quite there yet. So it's really that intersection of folks who've thought about both in a lot of detail that we get really excited about in the investing world.
Yeah. So I guess one of the other questions was kind of my own journey becoming a founder and a CTO. And it is so important. Like, I think also as scientists, we get trained on how to do these presentations and take all of these really technical questions. And it's just as hard to take those questions about the business side of it. How are you going to make money? What's your average like revenue? Like, how much do you need to fundraise and why do you need that amount? I think a lot of times when we think about writing grants or something for an NIH, R01 or whatever, we kind of work backwards from like, I want the full $1 million that I'm entitled to get. I'm going to fit the science to the 1 million. But sometimes fundraising, it's the total opposite. Like you have to decide what is that business plan milestone, that business plan thing that you got to do until your next round of fundraising, and then figure out how much is that going to cost. So if you're doing like drug discovery work, how much is it going to be to do toxicology? How much is it going to be to do ADME? How much is it going to be to do animal studies? All right, tally that up, add in the salaries, and you have your fundraising amount. Then you go around pitching this business plan, this investor deck that is, to me as a scientist, shockingly light on the science when you're presenting to investors. It's just like, don't you want to know how cool this is? Let me tell you about mass spectrometry because I think it's the neatest thing. And they're like, I really don't care. Tell me very like easily digestible terms. What is the technology? What are you doing with it? And why should I give you my money for it? So I don't know if anybody else has any kind of feedback on that stage of it. That was definitely something I never learned in my PhD. Learned how to give a great presentation at US HUPO or ASMS, but never how to pitch.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing I'll add to that, Lindsay, is like I don't want that to come across as being, and also when I talk about like science and business are both important, like I don't want that to come across as being a barrier to any of you getting excited about starting a company. Like every single person on this call is able to learn enough business in order to be able to pitch effectively. So it's something you need to put the time into and to learn how to do and get feedback, and don't be afraid to fail. But it should not be a barrier for you to starting a company on something that you're excited about.
Yeah, I think the parallel that I always draw is that my first year where I really decided I was going to make a company felt like I was doing the first year of grad school over again, in that like I don't know about other programs, but at least at Berkeley, the first year is just you're doing everything at once and you're bad at everything, and that's okay. And I actually really enjoyed that as I was taking on this new opportunity. Was like, I enjoy being bad at things because it means I'm learning the most that I could possibly be learning at that time. And that's that's a part of being a scientist, is taking in new information. And so I think, yeah, as Emily said, everyone here is capable of doing it. You've been through it if you're anywhere into your grad program already. And so it just takes being comfortable with being bad at a thing again after you've now mastered this other set of skills.
Yep, definitely be prepared for a couple of those investor meetings, just be told straight out to your face, that was awful. And it's like, all right, cool, we'll try again. So I guess along this topic, Professor Van Eyck had a question related to the current upswing in venture capital and business investment in proteomics. It just seems like proteomics is getting really popular. A couple companies off the top of my head, there's like this huge arms race right now on what technology is going to replace mass spectrometry, right? These protein sequencer companies that are just raising bananas amount of money. There's companies like ECR Bio, which has this nanoparticle technique for doing plasma proteomics with a mass spec readout. Like, it just seems like there is a lot of interest in proteomics. It's a great time for biotech investment right now. What are kind of your opinions on this? Is this a bubble? Do you think that proteomics is really going to replace some of the genomics-based companies in VC interest portfolios? Kind of curious. It's a little bit of a controversial question. So thanks, Jenny, for raising that one.
I'll jump in. Happy to give my opinion. So I don't think it's a bubble. I think we've seen proteomics have, starts and stops all along the way. I think the difference is here is that we're starting to see some of the limitations of genomics. So I come from a genomics background at NGS, where we launched precision oncology, looking at patient tumors. And when I left JAX, one of the reasons I had a couple of different fields that I liked. And one was proteomics, because I felt it could really complement some of the shortcomings that I saw in genomics. When we're looking at, granted, the therapies, we've had a huge impact in success rates in cancer, but still, when you have a drug that less than 15% of people respond to, I mean, come on. So I think that the multi-omics and the proteomics can really help solve major problems. We can, and as scientists, we should demand, and as human beings, to do better than 15 to 30% response rate. Like, that to me is not acceptable. So I don't think it's a bubble. I think we're going to see a lot of complementary between information we get from these multi-omics, proteomics being one of them. So as far as the arms race, my personal opinion on the landscape, I don't think that we're going to see any one technology. I don't think we're going to see Illumina for proteomics. I think there's going to be fit for purpose use of different technologies in proteomics to address different questions. So I think the market is big enough. And what's nice is that because genomics has come down in price so much, it leaves the opportunity for investment dollars with proteomics. So I don't think the bubble's going to go away. I'm super excited for this space with all these new companies and technology and learning. I think there'll be a big push to get it into diagnostics. My personal opinion is mass spec will push the multivariate front first in the regulatory domain for diagnostics, breaking down those barriers and concerted efforts, and others will follow that path as their technologies evolve fit for purpose. So I could go on and on, but this is where I love this kind of stuff. It's really fun. So, but I'll stop and let other people express their opinions too.
Yeah, I love it. Anybody else thoughts?
I'd point to something that I've been seeing in a lot of the investor meetings I've been holding, and I'd love to hear if Emily's group also thinks this, but what I've been hearing repeated over and over again is that the startup cost for a biotech company is roughly now what the startup cost for a new internet company was in the 90s. And so there's a lot of people that are drawing parallels between how we're exponentially decreasing the cost of starting new biotech ventures. And so I think that's why Ginkgo, for example, had this huge IPO, because they're trying to build a platform that supports this kind of new wave of biotech venture that is now possible in a way that it really hasn't been historically. And so I think proteomics, as a part of that, being a fundamental support framework to enable this new kind of generation of biotech companies, is a thing that will be seeing increasing demand. I totally agree with Susan on that. I think this is just the start, and there's going to be so much more demand because the upfront cost of starting a biotech is decreasing so rapidly. That's a pretty huge marketplace that's going to be opened up because so many scientists will be able to start companies when they wouldn't have been able to previously.
Yeah, so I can jump on my 2 cents here. So I will say that, like, I'm in private equity, I'm not in venture, so it's a little bit of a different cut of the apple. So we don't typically look at quite as early stage companies as what's being discussed here. Like, I guess, like, if I just think of the question, and it has been a while since I've been in proteomics specifically as well. But if I think of the question just from like a 30,000 foot view, I would guess that this would be a little bit more like what Marco was saying, like lower cost of biotech startups, as well as a maturation of the technology. We're just seeing a number of technologies outside of genomics that are like maturing in the last 5 to 10 years. So, you know, thinking through like what are the pros and cons, like probably it's all like for me, it seems positive that there's more interest, it's becoming more mainstream, you know, et cetera. But again, this is not like the core for me. So like, this is a little bit more just like my personal opinion, having worked in proteomics at one point in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious. We've listed a whole ton of pros. Are there any cons? I guess the only con I can think of is it feels, at least to me, like it's a lot harder to explain proteomics to some investors unless they're very biotech savvy to start. Versus I feel like a lot of investors just kind of understand like, oh, I'm using CRISPR or like, you know, whatever genomics technology. It's those genomics technologies have really entered, I think, like household common knowledge. Versus some proteomic stuff, I feel like it gets very jargony very fast. So explaining to investors in like one slide why your proteomics tech or your proteomics technique is important for their investment portfolio can be a little tricky.
Yeah, Lindsay, I think that's a really good point. You know, I think with all the different technologies out there, you know, with NGS, right, we had Sanger sequencing as our ground truth, orthogonal validation. We don't have that really for proteomics. And when you have so many competing technologies, all of that may make it a little bit harder for adoption and to be able to understand it. So if that was a con in this proteomics upswing right now in the market, I would say that may be one that may push progress because you don't have an easy way to do orthogonal validation.
Yeah, and Jenny's got some comments in the chat. She's thinking maybe one of the cons is a failure or being unable to make milestones. So kind of, you know, making sure that these mass spec assays or these proteomics assays are going to be able to get approval from the FDA if you're doing like diagnostics or something. It's maybe a little bit harder because as a field, maybe we've had a history of sometimes not delivering. And, you know, the fate of companies before you can affect your ability to raise money from investors. Because if they see some big company that failed and failed like massively, they're going to be more shy to invest in your company if it's using the same, you know, protein molecules, it's using the same kind of technology. So that's another good point for a con. So Harrison has, oh, go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say another potential con is, you know, a lot of the proteomic stuff in and of itself isn't a product that you can make a big return on, right? So you see a lot of proteomics and service-based companies, and that's great for lowering the cost of biotech startups that want to use proteomics as part of their target discovery campaign or anything like that. But when it comes to proteomics per se, you know, what is the product? What is, you know, you have to use it to develop a therapeutic, for example, in order for it to, you know, really make sense to invest in for, you know, the investors, because they're looking for that big return. And if you're just, unless you're selling the machine, you know, I don't think there's a whole lot of return there for proteomics in and of itself. And maybe that could be a bad assumption.
Yeah, I love it. So we've got just about 15 more minutes. So if you've got any questions, make sure you ask them now. Harrison has a question. Are there more opportunities for proteomics to make an impact for patients as a diagnostic, as a platform for, or service, or as a component of therapeutic ventures? So I'm going to take this question as kind of like, of these three, I guess, kind of business models, which one maybe has the most opportunities for proteomics? Diagnostic, platform, therapeutic style venture? Like, kind of curious what everybody thinks. I know for my own company, we have kind of like a blended business model where we have a platform that we can offer as a fee for service, but internally we're using that platform to do our own therapeutic work, our own internal drug development pipeline. in that business model, we're so young, I can't tell you if that's going to work or not, but a lot of platform companies use that kind of business model, get some external data generation or some external revenue coming in with these kind of collaborative like contract work while you're doing your own internal stuff. So kind of curious, anybody else like familiar with, kind of what companies maybe even in the proteomics space have been doing as far as these three business models?
I think, the platform run right now for the market, I think diagnostics, at least at the level we're thinking with, big protein type panels is a bit off. So I think people looking upstream, platform companies always do well, but it's a pick and shovel model, right? It's a well-proven trotted business model. And so I think, having a consumable line, oftentimes you give away the instrumentation for free, getting revenue from your consumable line. So I think we're seeing a lot of platform companies right now. I think we'll see that diverge into diagnostics and therapies as well. All of that, I like the diagnostic market. That's always the place a lot where I've spent a lot of my career in. And what's nice about the diagnostic market that I think is very attractive is, unlike genetics, right? One and done, right? People don't often go back and get resequenced, right? So having longitudinal testing utilizing proteomics is a nice reoccurring business model. So I'm a big fan of how the diagnostic market is going to play out.
I'll just throw in my 2 cents as not as a company focusing on proteomics, but one thing that we've also seen, which aligns with Lindsay's kind of focus, which is that the most investor interest from early stage VCs has come from a tandem ability to both have a licensable product coupled with a eventual downstream application of that for therapeutic insight, therapeutic development. And so it's we've seen a lot of pressure for this hybrid model approach, because you have both the kind of upfront security of easy, quick quote unquote revenue with the eventual very large upside potential of a therapeutic. And we've seen a lot of excitement from VCs when we talk about that particular application of it. But I think it leads to a very challenging position for founders, because then you have to start 2 different types of companies simultaneously, which is exhausting.
Yeah, great point. It's very popular with early stage VC, so you can get that money to get started. But if you're basically trying to found 2 companies at once, it can get messy fast.
Yeah, there goes out the lean business model, right? It's really hard. And you're always strapped for capital in terms of money and human resources, right? And then trying to do 2 different paths, it's really challenging. So I think the trick there is trying to find synergies, right? Picking client projects, if you can have that luxury, that align with your downstream goals. So you're building core competencies with client revenue and keeping in line and laser focused on that end goal.
And I think that that's a really good point, is that, as you start developing any product and you start actually once you start getting close to a product market fit, as Stephen called it earlier, which is a term that you'll become very inundated if you start on this pathway, you'll find more and more people interested in your thing. And I think the hardest thing is saying no to some of those early people that are starting to bite at your company, and they're like, oh, I'd like to use it for this. And if that doesn't align with where you ultimately want to go, it can be very hard to say no to that early cash when you're like, I can't even pay myself right now. How do we do this? I think it's a really interesting decision tree to me following, and it can be tricky.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. It definitely, as you start kind of getting contracts or getting customers, they're going to start saying, oh, well, could you do X with this type of platform? And it's like, well, I could, but I could barely do what I'm already doing with it. So it can be tough to stay lean, like Susan said. Like, you don't want to have to hire a huge team just to keep things going. You want to stay as small as possible, as long as possible. To kind of establish that product market fit, talk to more customers, see what they like, see what they don't like, and build a business plan that has a history of working. So I did have a question kind of circling back to the very beginning where we were talking about developing leadership skills. A couple of us had mentioned books that you thought were really impactful or helpful. If we could drop some of those books either in the chat or just say them out loud real quick, any of those kind of leadership skill books that people particularly liked?
I'm a big fan of Radical Candor, one of my favorites.
Oh, I'm reading that one right now. I'm glad to hear you say that.
And the other one that I really like, I think that can help in anybody's career, is a book called Managing Up. And it's about identifying different types of leadership styles. And it's not just about, upward. I use it to identify leadership styles of colleagues I'm working with, and just being able to identify how they tick so I can alter my approach. So Managing Up and Radical Candor are my two favorites.
I think one big thing you need to know before you can start managing is what exactly you need to manage. So one book I recommend if you're interested in startups is a book called Biotechnology Entrepreneurship. It's a creative title, but it does cover every aspect of from idea to product. And there's another one called Biodesign that Stanford used for a long time as part of one of their MBA classes to teach about biotech entrepreneurship. So if you only know the science right now, those might be two good books to look at just to understand all of the different aspects of developing a product, all of the different teams that are involved, and the different ways that a company starts, builds, develops product.
One other recommendation that I would add on top of Steve's is also reading outside of your industry. I get some of my best ideas reading about other industries, and there's a lot of good books, even like reading Shoe Dog, The Story of Nike, or The Monk of Mocha. It really gets you to think about how things happen in different industries and how they approached it and what you could leverage to bring into the biotech world. So I try to read outside of my area of expertise in biotech as much as possible.
I think the other thing we haven't mentioned, so it seems like there's definitely a lot of interest in sort of spinning out startups from PhD in this group. So the other thing that we haven't talked about is like another path to that is to work for a couple of years after your PhD in a business context in order to learn more about the business world, like even while you're developing your startup in the background. So, consulting is a really great place. That's where I learned a lot about business. Like a lot of the big consulting firms will hire like PhDs straight out of their program, even without business experience, and take the time to train them. There's also like equity research. There's like a lot of places that will hire, a reasonable number of places that will hire PhDs without a ton of business experience. And that is like a really valuable way to get the sort of baseline business experience that will be helpful in your startup. Like it's obviously like not fully necessary, but like it is a path.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what my co-founder had done. He worked for a startup and kind of learned about how to launch a startup by working at a startup as a very early employee. So if you get in the first, like 10 or 20 employees, you're going to be really exposed to everything that goes on in a startup, because at that stage, you may have a PhD to do science, but you're probably going to be asked to do a lot of other things that you had no idea how to do. So we got a question for Emily. How did you start consulting?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, like I said, towards the end of my PhD, I realized I was interested in science, but didn't want to do lab work. I did an internship at Genentech. Basically, ended up doing about 30 to 40 informational interviews as part of that internship, including with a consultant a former consultant from McKinsey. I realized that it was a great place for me to get a broad view of other industries. And basically, like, this is not a traditional path to consulting, but the day of the informational interview, this person was like, oh, you should check when applications are due. I think they're due soon. And I went home and they were due that day. So I brushed up on my resume, submitted it, crammed for 6 weeks to learn how to do cases, did an interview and was lucky to get an offer. So it was it's a little bit of a non-traditional path into consulting, but I applied is how I did this. Was lucky enough to get an offer. I think the things that helped me be successful were I had spent a lot of time outside of my lab doing things like I worked as a editor-in-chief of a graduate student-run journal. I did a pretty big diversity and inclusion effort at my PhD, just lots of time outside of lab building up those skills that I ended up talking about during my interview experience. And there's, but that's basically like, if it's an application cycle, it's about a year before you start. So if you're looking to graduate next year, you should be looking at it now. And then you basically like practice a lot of cases to go about doing those interviews.
I'd actually.
Yeah, so we've got just a couple minutes left. So these are all of our last thoughts. And if you still have more questions, feel free. I've been doing kind of a Twitter thread on some of the most salient points that we've gone over. Feel free to ask me in that thread and I can answer anything or pass it along to our speakers. So yeah, last thoughts, Marco?
Just, there was another question of what people look for in PhDs when we're looking to hire them. Everything Emily said is the things that we were looking for in our first hires, is finding people that did things outside of their lab. That's a lot of what has made the final decision on hiring someone or not.
I'll say same. When we were looking to hire, it was definitely a huge bonus when an applicant had some sort of experience doing something a little bit different. For example, during their PhD, working for some of these venture capital or working at Cooley to help do like science vetting. So those kind of things were really great because early stage startup, like I said, you're going to have to wear a lot of hats. So it's not just I published a bunch of papers, I went to a bunch of conferences. It's also I can tell that you have some flexibility and you can do some things outside of the box.
I'll add just a couple, passing thoughts that, first and foremost, do what you're passionate about. Like I always love science. I'm thrilled and so lucky to continue to have my hands in the science and combine it in a different way creatively with the business side of it. Try lots of things. We're all scientists, we're all researchers. Your career and how you approach it should be something that you pay attention to at least on a monthly basis, if not weekly. You should continue to research things and follow people along that you're like, hey, that's a cool job. Go talk to them, talk to people, get outside of the building, try lots of things, be passionate, have fun, work hard, and things start to come together. But if you just sit in the lab going, I wish I could do that or that, like get out every week, set some goals to try, talk to somebody. You've got to treat your career as part of your own job.
Yeah, and one other thing for me, like if consulting is like consulting and investment is kind of a hard thing to figure out how to get into if you haven't done it or if you don't have connections to do it. You can find me on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to have a 20-minute conversation with folks, particularly if you're like in an academic setting and like trying to get over to the consulting side. Like, please reach out. I'm happy to chat.
Yeah, likewise. I think my parting thought would just be that you do have the skills that it takes to do any of these jobs. And I think that I was so afraid of starting a company and just what I was going to do outside of my PhD that it was very scary thinking about taking this big leap to like making a company, which seemed like such a foreign concept to me. And you didn't have any idea what you were getting in for when you signed up for the PhD either. And look where you are now. So you can do it and you will be able to develop these skills. So don't think that you can't or that it's some foreign language that you're never going to be able to master, because it just takes time and practice.
Totally agree. I love that as kind of like our final thought. It is super intimidating and it's super scary. Unlike a PhD, you don't have to do it alone. Find some co-founders. If you really feel like you're weak on the business development side, go to that MBA program on your campus and see if there's, a new MBA grad who would want to go in with you as a co-founder. There's offices, there's people like Susan that you can meet with to talk about these kind of commercialization and tech transfer ideas. So reach out beyond kind of our core scientist circles. And yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to get in touch. And thanks for coming, everyone. We'll get the recording up as soon as we can.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, everyone.